everyone, welcome to Lies. I figure you know the drill. This is the part of Extra History where we talk about the mistakes we made and cover all the things we couldn't fit in. So let's get to the chase because I've got a lot to talk about today. First off, the big one. As many of you may have noticed, the narrative style was slightly different in this series, and it's because we were trying to give you more of a sense of the characters as people than just a litany of grand events. Because to me, when reading the story, that's what was important. The reason I brought Justinian into this is because we've heard this story before. It happens over and over in history, right? You've got a promising reign, an able leader, it's off to a fantastic start, but things unravel, and in the end, they doom their people, and even if that doom isn't apparent for a few generations, they doom themselves. So what's important here is not the what of history, right, but the why. Why does this happen over and over? Why have we seen this parallel? Why has this happened before? And most importantly, why does it seem to happen less today? What's changed in order to make this less common? And those are the questions I'd ask if I were teaching this in a school, right? If I were giving a test on it, it wouldn't be what year did Mohatch happen, or what was the name of Suleiman's closest friend, but why did things fall apart? And why don't they fall apart in the same way today? And to get the heart of that, you have to understand the actors. And luckily, Suleiman is one of the few people in history where we have his poetry, we have all these reports of his moods, that we know more of his internal life. And it's really important to know that because it's really easy just to chalk these up to overreach and ambition. In fact, whether it's Justinian or Suleiman, these sort of stories are often used as a morality tale to caution us to be content with what you have, right? Don't get greedy. And I think that is part of the lesson here, but I think it's also an oversimplification that doesn't help us reflect enough on how we got to the world we live in today and what we should be doing in the world we live in today. Because if you look at almost any of these cases, you almost see one of two factors in almost all of them, either distrust or personal sentimentality. And for Suleiman, things unravel so fast because he's plagued with both, right? And that's the tragedy of this story, because he's a solid ruler, and he's a solid ruler in a system that makes this tragedy almost inevitable. And that's what makes the story such a good place to think about how we got to where we are today. Because to me, one of the ways to look at history, and specifically the history of governance and how humanity has improved and refined governing, is to look at how we've created systems that add trust and remove that personal sentimentality. And actually, that's the real question I'd ask on a test about Suleiman. What have we done since Suleiman's time to create more trust between members of our government and reduce the possibility that personal sentimentality overrides the concerns of the state? Here's a very minor example. Why doesn't the US president worry about their second in command assassinating them and instigating a coup, like happens so often all across history? And it's because that person knows that in 8 years, they could be president. They don't have to overthrow the government and end up in power. In fact, it's simpler and easier for them just to wait. So less paranoia, more trust is built into the system. And I know I tangent, but these are actually the sort of lessons I think are hugely important in history, and to think about them in the minutiae, not just to think about, oh, we've moved away from monarchy, democracy is better, but why? Why are these new forms of government better? Because it's important to us today to understand how we've improved things like government, and so we can think about how to continue to do so. And it's hyperbolic, right? But think about if we'd gotten to the nuclear age with any of the governments we've seen on EH. I don't think there's a chance you make it through the first 50 years without a nuclear war. And as I pondered this, I came to realize that over the last 20 years, I've seen us all around the globe seem to, in some ways, be moving in the opposite direction from many of the ideas that we came to over the last millennia to make sure that this sort of thing doesn't happen, that our leaders aren't pushed into this spiral of paranoia and personal interest. So in these episodes, the biggest lie we told, and in fact, the only real lie, was the ending sequence. We have no way of knowing what Suleiman's last thoughts or last moments were. But in reading his poetry and the accounts of the waning years of his life, it was clear that he was the sort of person who regretted all these things, and yet felt compelled to do them anyway. And that to me is the most important part of the series. Because if you can have a competent, intelligent man walk down the path of this tragedy, it forces us to investigate what's behind it. Unfortunately, I will confess that when I was writing this, I was determined to get us away from doing any more two-parters because there's so many historical figures I could write 12 episodes on. And so when I tried to hit everything that you get in a College 101 overview of the Ottoman Empire, there are a few aspects of Suleiman's reign that I didn't get to touch on nearly enough. For example, Suleiman was a great patron of the arts. Not only was he a notable poet himself, but he also drew the greatest artists and architects to his court with his patronage. And this not only helped establish a distinct Ottoman style, but the buildings that got built and the style that he established leaves its mark on the world today. Not only in Istanbul, right, which there are many buildings which come from his reign, but if you go to Jerusalem, the Dome of the Rock and the very walls of Jerusalem that you visit are his building projects. I speak of his poetry. By the way, his handle when writing poetry literally translates to lover. So he could be a bit of a dork at times too. But besides the art, he also raised the level of education in the empire well above anything found anywhere else in Europe and made it far more accessible to common people. He, at the same time, added protection for other peoples of the book, right, Jews and Christians, and improved their legal status. I read several modern scholars that argued that life was actually better for a Christian serf under Suleiman's reign than it was under any of the other European powers. And for the Jews, right, this is only a couple of years after they're kicked out of Spain. And speaking of his laws, his kanun, which, by the way, comes from the same Greek word that we get the English word canon from, like and something is canon. I thought that was neat. These are also a huge achievement as they rationalize government. And I totally screwed up in the episode and wrote them as Kanuni with an I at the end. And that's what the Ottomans actually called Suleiman. Kanuni means lawful or lawgiver, whereas Kanun is law. My fault. Which brings me, of course, to his title. It's only in the West that we call him the Magnificent. Most of the Ottoman world would actually go with calling him Suleiman the Lawgiver. And many of you asked why we called him the Magnificent if, especially in his later life, he leads us to crisis, and most of the battles he won required overwhelming force. But it's actually more straightforward than it looks like from this period. The places where he was winning were places where the Turks had always lost before. And you have to remember how hard it still was to take a fortified position in the early 1500s. Most of the cases where he fought with overwhelming numbers, the odds weren't nearly as in favor for him as they looked, right? And in doing this, in being able to take these positions, he actually expanded the empire massively and threatened all of Europe by taking key points in Eastern Europe and the Mediterranean. That plus sort of the sheer grandeur of the Ottoman court in Constantinople, and he starts getting this appellation. But all right, let's dive into the episodes because we barely started and I am running on. So episode 1. A lot of people wanted to know about whether the Ottomans referred to the city as Constantinople or Istanbul. And this was awesome hearing people ask this because we discussed it internally, as I originally was just using all the terms that people threw around for Constantinople just scattered throughout the series. But as the other members of the EC crew very rightly pointed out, that was super confusing. So we just went with Istanbul as that was what most of the common people would refer to it as. Constantinople, though, was still used and was what, or at least the Turkish version of that word was still used and was what you'd find on most of the official documents. I did manage to sneak in one reference to it as the Sublime Gate, though. I was proud of that. But also in episode 1, if you remember the girding ceremony where Suleiman is made sultan, well, The very last girding ceremony that ever took place in 1918 was filmed, and you can still find footage of it if you want an idea of what this might have looked like. Though the black and white silent film of the Ottoman Empire basically on its deathbed is probably not as spectacular as what Suleiman might have had going on, it's still one of those rare things that we can see a tradition captured on film that was similar 500 years ago. Oh, and remember in the first episode, I started talking about Christian countries striking the bell at noon to celebrate the Ottomans being thrown back from Belgrade in 1456? Well, that was an order of the Pope, and the Pope kind of forgot to ever rescind that order. So if you're in a country or part of a church where they still have noon bell, that's actually why. So to this day, we accidentally celebrate the victory at that battle. And one of the raddest things, one of you guys mentioned that in the first episode, one of our Janissaries had a beard, but Janissaries were actually forbidden to grow beards until later in that century, and I totally didn't know that. And speaking of Janissaries, there seemed to be some confusion around what they were. They are slaves, but slavery often meant a very different thing in the Ottoman Empire than how we think of it often today. These guys were salaried, they got pensions, they were of high social standing, and they were an important part of government life. They were closer to the Praetorian Guard, an elite military unit, theoretically solely at the command of the head of state, right? That's more what they're like than we would normally think of as slave troops. But really, they were a power unto themselves, and when the head of state was weak, we'll see them step in if we do more Ottoman history. And at this point in history, they were taken from Christian families in remote parts of the empire. This was to ensure that they were loyal to no one but the Sultan, as their families would be far away, and they would have no ties to the Turkish nobility. Oddly, I saw this practice written up in two very different ways in the books I read. One sort of school of history talked about it as this hated practice of taking children away from their parents, and another talked about it as something almost looked forward to, as a boy would have a far better life as a janissary than as a peasant on some remote farm. So I don't know what to make of that. Also, episode 2. You probably know that it's pretty dubious whether Luther actually nailed anything to a door, but you probably also know exactly what we're referring to when we reference it. It was the fastest shorthand for the events that kicked off the Protestant Reformation. But more than that, this myth came about almost immediately after the events themselves, and I like the idea of Suleiman getting this sort of word-of-mouth understanding that probably would filter to the Ottoman Empire from Northern Europe, right? So, hence that. Also, in that vein, some people were confused by us referring to Charles V as that Spanish prince, because he was, after all, the Holy Roman Empire. No, he was not the whole empire, he was the emperor. Anyway, I did this because throughout his whole life, right, Suleiman refused to ever call him anything but that Spanish prince, because Suleiman considered himself an heir to the Roman Empire, and one of the titles he would give him is Caesar and Emperor of the Romans. And there would be only one emperor in his world, and it certainly wasn't going to be Charles. So, of course, he only calls him that Spanish prince. I think that's it for episode 2. For episode 3, Roxolana, right? There's no evidence that her hair was red, but for centuries people thought it was because of her name and the etymology of it. But her name is probably more a reference to where she came from than the color of her hair. And it's not 100% certain what her hair color may be, because she liked to... There's a lot of references, actually, to the fact that she liked to dress up in costumes and wear wigs. But as to where she came from, she was probably Ukrainian, but that part of Ukraine was part of Poland at the time. And when talking about these things, we generally go with the nation that was there as they existed at the time, because otherwise we just get way too confusing. So hence us referring to her as Polish. Also, and most importantly, if you misspell her name in Google, you get the adorable golden snub-nosed monkey, which I highly encourage everyone to look up. All right. So also in this episode, I referenced something using stone as a unit of measurement, right? There's no way they would use stone. But I kid you not, the measurement they would have used was Batman. That's right, Batman. Spelled Batman. Pronounced pretty close to Batman. And I knew that if I wrote horses and steel 180 Batman in weight, we'd all be cracking up and the episode would just be over. So I went with stone. Sorry, Batman. Let's see, what else? Oh, this is important. You know when Ibrahim's worried about getting too much power too fast and Suleiman says he'd never execute him? This is 100% absolutely an attested event. Basically, as usual, everything is, but I wanted to make sure to call this one out so people don't think it was simply for dramatic purposes. And there was a little bit of confusion about Buda and Pest. Budapest used to be two cities that very sensibly just smashed the names together when they became one. And the art on the dead prince scene is supposed to show him lying in a marsh a bit away from the battlefield, but that wasn't terribly clear since the whole battlefield looked marshy. Sorry about that. He was not actually found on the battlefield. He was found nearby in a marsh having fled. In episode 4, we accidentally said 1592 instead of 1529, and I don't know how that slipped by because the art team had it right there in the same scene, so mea culpa, mea maxima culpa. And I love this one. When we draw the John with the Holy Crown of Hungary, the little cross at the top is tilted. This actually hasn't happened yet. It won't happen until the 17th century when someone accidentally slams the lid of a trunk down on the crown. I would hate to be that guy. Episode 5, where everything goes south. We didn't talk enough about why Suleiman gets suspicious, and that's because I wanted to talk about it with a caveat here. Basically, Ibrahim supports Mustafa, the son that Suleiman eventually kills. This makes him and Roxolana clash a great deal, and as the story goes, Roxolana starts poisoning Suleiman against Ibrahim and Mustafa. This rings to me a lot of the old wicked stepmother trope you hear all the time in ancient histories, so I wanted to bring that up and bring that caveat up. On the other hand, there's a lot of cause for this to be true in this case, where it's not with most of these wicked stepmother things, so make of it what you will. The only thing I'll add is that Ibrahim was, by most accounts, as powerful, if not more powerful than the Sultan by this point. And he knew it. And he was growing more arrogant, telling people that they could just see him rather than the Sultan. And while it's highly questionable to me if he would ever betray the Sultan, whether he would ever betray Suleiman, right? Because he could never rule in his own right, and as a slave, and he was just way better off with Suleiman as a puppet, or at least a partner, right, than he is without him. But I can sort of see one semi-convincing argument that might have been used with Suleiman, which is that he was going to have Suleiman assassinated and install Mustafa instead. Which is far-fetched to me, but I can see it, and I can see how even the possibility of this act would seem far too dire not to respond. And also, regarding Ottoman inheritance, it was common practice that had even been codified into law that when a new sultan was raised up, all of the other claimants to the throne, i.e. the rest of the previous sultan's children and all their families, were murdered. In fact, it wasn't unheard of, as in the case of Suleiman's father, for this to start even before the previous sultan was dead. And while this may seem horrific, it actually saved them from a plethora of civil wars that rocked so many other countries. And when I first started to dive into this, it raised a lot of questions to me about the good of the many versus just our most basic moral laws against things like filicide. But it wasn't uncommon for what Suleiman ends up doing. Alright, so on that upbeat note, let's just talk about episode 6. Here I want to talk about the rain, because Eastern European rain has been a problem for armies well into the 20th century. Some people were expressing surprise that it was getting hampered so badly by a little rain, but the truth is, this is the very beginning of professional armies. We're at the point where an army doesn't just scavenge off the land, just looting the populace wherever they can, right? In fact, Suleiman's army was even incredibly disciplined in this regard. Men were executed for things as minor as letting their horses graze on a peasant's field. But this is a new thing. They haven't developed all the techniques of supply and provision that will allow armies to be more than foraging parties. And so, yeah, the reign's a serious deal. But on to Walpole, because this one is awesome. The art of our version of Suleiman is based off the famous portrait of Suleiman by Titian. In the 1700s, a fellow by the name of John Baptist Jackson, I think, started making prints of Titian's work to prove how good modern printing could be. Horace Walpole, the son of the Walpole, thought they were horrifically bad. But did that stop him from owning them? No. Instead, in a very Walpole way, he built a gallery in his house to artistic fakes and filled it with wallpaper that was supposed to look like Gothic frescoes and statues he was pretty sure were fake. And then he hung the Titian prints so that when you'd enter, you'd think they were some sort of barbaric bas-relief. And this gave him endless amusement, as did the fact that he was elevating the prints back to being art. Walpoling. But that's about it for me today. Rarely do we get to do something with so much of a record of the inner life of a leader. Through his poetry and reports sent back to Europe, we get to see the inner life of Suleiman. And rarer still do we get to see someone so driven, so clearly down a path that they and their empire will regret the rest of their days. So as we move ourselves in a world just filled with upheaval, it's worth looking to history and asking ourselves, how do we retain all the things that have helped us divorce our modern governments from these same dilemmas? Because although there's no chance in much of the world of going back to autocratic monarchy, in subtle ways, we may be rolling back some of the things that have insulated us from these sort of tragedies and that make our governments run, if certainly not smoothly, better than in the past. So I'm going to sign off there. And as always, if you liked the awesome music by the Kinders, we're putting up a separate video that'll probably be up by the time this goes live. And we have a rad t-shirt for sale of the opening art for this series. It is awesome, and you should go buy it by clicking a link that is going to be somewhere around my body. All right, there, good, done. And thanks to all the patrons who voted on the early Christian Schisms episodes for the next set. This will be one of our most difficult topics, but it's also one I've really wanted to do. It won't be about anything exciting like witch burning or anything like that, and it won't be about making any judgment calls around any of the branches of Christianity. Instead, if I do my job right, it'll be the primer I wish I had when I was first learning about the Roman Empire. Because understanding these various heresies and schisms is a huge part of understanding what's going on in Roman politics and Roman society. But for me, coming from outside the faith, it was always just so difficult to keep them straight. So hopefully this helps and lets me get away with just putting up a little link next time I have to mention something like Monophysitism in the Justinian series. So with that, thank you again to all the patrons, and for anyone who wants to be involved in choosing future series, the vote's going on right now, so patrons go vote. If you want to be involved, join the Patreon, and I will see you next time for our early Christian Schisms. Take care, everybody.